So to say it again, I think the most important thing is to see the problem, which means seeing how the problem arises. Of secondary importance is trying to solve the problem. It's not of secondary importance to think about the problem. It's not of secondary importance to wonder about the problem. But it is of secondary importance to think that you have a solution to the problem. I don't think that that's really all that important in a strange way in philosophy. However, you kind of have to make your decisions, I think. You don't have to, but we end up making our decisions, I think, in terms of the fundamental problems of philosophy. We make we sort of throw our bets one way or another. And I think that we tend to do that with this problem of the world. And you might say that we could narrow down things to some extent from that, calling this the problem of the world. It's really kind of the problem of realism, whether, you know, and the problem of reality. You know, how real do we think the world is, or what do we think it means for the world to be real? That cleared things up, didn't it? However, if we think about that fundamental problem of, on the one hand, that we have this intuition that we live in a world of things. On the other hand, it may be that certain reflections lead us to believe that none of us have ever actually experienced a thing. So how do we resolve that problem? This chapter gives us certain choices. The first choice, I think, is kind of fairly common choice, and that is Locke's choice, and that is transcendental realism. You know, the idea is that yes, I have experiences, sensations, perceptions, ideas of a world that is apart from me. I can only directly experience those subjective things, ideas, perceptions, sensations, and the things that I presume to be the causes of those subjective experiences, they transcend the limits of my experience. I cannot experience them directly, yet I believe that they are real. Now, what I can actually say about them, in terms of what truth I can ever get about things that transcend the limits of my experience, that leads me into certain puzzles. However, I do believe that my experiences, my subjective experiences, are caused by an external world. I do believe there is an external world. I believe it is populated by things, and I believe that I am in a certain relation with those things, and that I can cope with those things in a certain way through my subjective experiences. And it may be that I have to qualify everything I say about them to a certain degree and say, well, what I say about the things in the world is utterly dependent upon my subjective impressions of them. Yet that's how the world makes sense to me. That is, that my subjective impressions are in some way caused by, and perhaps in other ways related to, these things that are independent of me. Let's call that transcendental realism. It's what Locke thought. There are other choices available to me which are just as rational, maybe even more rational, or reasonable, or plausible. There is Berkeley and his idealism. Let's call it his. It's referred to in the text as subjective idealism, and that's fine. It helps us to sort of remind ourselves what we're committing ourselves to some degree. And that is maybe on the face of it sounds like more radical, because it throws away the idea that we're living in a world of independent physical things that cause certain subjective impressions in us, and we commit ourselves to the idea that, well, since we have no actual experience of such things, and because of certain logical reasons, Berkeley says that the idea of a physical thing, of a material object, which is not a thought or an idea, is a contradiction, because you cannot conceive of it when you conceive of something, you're conceiving of an idea. Trying to conceive of something which is not an idea is impossible. So you know what he says? Everything's an idea. Now it's not maybe that simple, and it may be that we can reconstruct some of our requirements for living in a rational world by accounting for things like the persistence of objects or things like that under the condition that everything is just an idea. But it is still a radical way of looking at the world, idealism, that reality is ideas. Let's just go all the way and say that, what we experience is reality, and everything that we experience is an idea, so reality is ideas. It makes sense. It may be that we have to throw away that fundamental intuition about living in a world populated by objects that are independently existing and non-ideas out there, but it makes sense. The great attempt in the history of philosophy to sort of split the difference between these two views is Kant, and he is briefly explained in this chapter. And his philosophy, or his response to the problem, let's say, is called transcendental idealism. And that would lead, to a real explanation of that. Boy, that's a big subject in philosophy, and Kant is usually viewed as a notoriously difficult philosopher. But Kant's transcendental idealism is that, as I take it, is that, within our experience, things like primary qualities are real. They're a real part of our experience. When we come upon a physical object, what we take to be a physical object, we recognize that some things are purely subjective. Some of our ideas about them are purely subjective, like color and taste and things like that. But there are other aspects of them and aspects of our experience which we would call sort of primary qualities of things, like maybe their solidity or extension, or the fact that they appear in space and time, which is a big aspect of Kant's philosophy, thinking about the nature of what space and time really are. But say that something is in space or that something is in time is a real part of experience, in the sense that we couldn't have an experience of a thing unless it was in space and unless we experienced it in time. But when we think about those things transcendentally, as we think about the world apart from our experience of it, space and time and perhaps primary qualities are revealed as mere ideas. But as viewed empirically in terms of our experience, our engagement with the world, we come across what we would consider to be real qualities of things and real qualities of the world. But when we transcend from our own experience and try to think of or conceive of the world apart from us, those primary qualities are revealed as conditions of us, or requirements that we have to have experience, rather than the real qualities of things that are independent of us. So that's a whole other story. So I would say that, again, when we look back at a chapter like this, the most important thing is to see the problem, see why it's a problem. That's the real interest of philosophy, is that the world that we more or less in most of its fundamental aspects take for granted is actually quite puzzling. And our ideas about the world don't always fit together, and this leads to philosophical work. This is philosophical thought, is thought, and the wonderment of that. So the most important thing is to see where the problems are, and then yes, to think about the possible solutions, or at least resolutions to the problem. And an interesting thing is to see where you go. As an individual human being, what do you really think? What is your way of seeing the world, and how does that affect your choice of a solution to those problems?